We're excited to be here today. We have a panel where we're going to talk about token genesis events and some other trends. But yeah, I remember being at the first one in Austin, and it's amazing to see how it's all evolved. And we're really excited to be here today to talk to you all. So with that, I'll welcome the rest of the panel, and we could get right into it. So as Pat mentioned, my name is Jack Karagulleyan. I co-lead BDO's digital asset practice, working with digital asset native companies and traditional finance companies looking to adopt digital assets. Brandon?
I am Brandon Boyle. I lead our international tax practice. I work here in the Bay Area, but I work with clients all over the country on digital asset and token genesis transactions.
Hi, I'm Mitzi Chang. I'm a lawyer by training. I work for Goodwin, which is a global law firm, and I co-chair our digital assets and fintech practice, which we've had in terms of blockchain for the last 10 years.
Thank you. All right, so just to give you all a framework of what we're going to talk about what is a token genesis event, how does it work, why you should care, and why you're probably going to see a lot more of it. And then Brandon will get into some of the more of the mechanics and some tax implications, and Mitzi will talk about some of the regulatory and legal considerations for companies to have. But before we dive in, and at the end, we'll also talk about a trend, kind of building on some of the stuff that Pat mentioned. I have some thoughts on some of those that I'll share. So hopefully at the end, we'll just give one trend each to talk about that we're excited to see or we anticipate seeing. So before we dive in, who here has heard of a TGE? Raise your hand. All right, about 35% of the room. I was at a SEC conference last week talking about AI and crypto. Guess how many people raised their hands? 0. There was 1,200 people, right? So congratulations on being very ahead of the curve. So with that, a token genesis event is when a company or a protocol launches a token on a blockchain-powered network to use as some part of their business or a product, right? Common examples may include when a business wants to enable a decentralization mechanism from a governance protocol perspective, right? I always equate it to kind of being on the HOA, and that's valuable because you decide how high to cut the grass for the neighborhood, right? So similar, you get to make ecosystem decisions, right? And so we've seen a lot of that for certain protocols, especially some of the larger DeFi protocols that have been around. The other one that I think is more common in recent years too is where we have centralized and decentralized exchanges launching their own token. That's considered more of a utility token, where these tokens can be used for reduced fees and just other benefits by using it within the network, right? And so it also can be considered to be kind of a loyalty program, right, for users, where the company determines using an algorithmic formula, you've been a user for X amount of years, this how many transactions, and you get X amount of tokens into the wallet that you have connected to it, right? So like BNB for Binance is an example of that, right? And so why are companies doing this? And when you think about it, and you think about the ethos of Web3, right, the democratization of owning your own data, right, this is just another form of unlocking value. The example that I like to give is around airline miles. How many people here have airline miles that they never use and they wish they would? There you go. My wife yells about it all the time. She yells at me. What if those airline miles were put on a blockchain and they're tokens? And what if I'm able to sell it to someone who does want to use it on 92 cents on the dollar, right? That's good for me because I don't get yelled at and I get to monetize off that data that I wasn't previously able to monetize from. Good for the buyer who's saving about 7.5%, 8%, and great for the airline because they're expanding market participants and expanding liquidity pools. That's why, when you think about the RWA examples that Pat had up here, yeah, sure, secure transactions, faster transactions, cheaper fees, those are all great reasons to use the blockchain, but I think another big driver is just access to liquidity, market participants, right? And so for that same reason, we're seeing a lot of these products launch as TGE. So real quick on the how, there's usually 3 ways of doing this. The most popular is airdrops. You probably heard of those, right? Where tokens, this is common with centralized and decentralized exchanges, right? Where tokens are provided to your wallet. You've also heard of ICOs in the past. Those of you around in 2017, it was quite the controversial theme back then, but they're back, but they look different. There's a lot more regulatory scrutiny around it. We're seeing KYC now start to be accepted, not by all, but by some of these TGEs, right? So that's looking different. And then private sales, right, to accredited investors where it's sold prior to it being on mainnet or on exchanges, right? So that's a little bit about the how, right? And so a couple key decisions that companies need to make if they're considering this is, do you launch in the US or outside the US, right? And prior to 9 months ago and then changing the guard at SEC, most companies were doing this offshore because we did not have the regulatory clarity, right, that Pat had up on the screen earlier. And so people weren't sure what to do, and so they set things up offshore. Those who were doing it right had to relinquish control, had to hire directors, you know, and offshore, again, this expands operational costs and has different challenges, right? We're seeing that trend in a different direction. Most people are coming to us and saying, we want to launch in the US. And some products don't want the governance to be decentralized, right? They want to retain control. And you can't do that if you're also setting up a foundation that directors have that, the responsibility to run it, right? So we're seeing a lot of that. Brandon's gonna get more into some of the details on that. And then lastly, you know, a lot of these protocols also have a treasury element, a not-for-profit element that, you know, there's a responsibility, but maybe they're not accruing as much value to it, right? We're seeing the Wyoming Dunas be considered and 501c4s for some of these protocols where the fact patterns may align. So these are some of the key decisions when thinking about like why to do it, how to do it. Brandon, maybe you could talk a little bit more on some of the mechanics and the tax considerations for it.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll start just by saying, similar to where we're at from a regulatory perspective, the tax authorities and the tax world doesn't really know what to do with this. The whole concept of decentralization is new. The fact that you can have a situation where a company would give up a very valuable asset, not for its own benefit, but to create an ecosystem that multiple stakeholders could participate in. It's all new. And so nothing has been battle tested. There's no guidance. There's some guidance out there about reporting things. You've probably seen the IRS kind of put stuff out there and then withdraw it. But all of this is really a new area, not just for the US tax authorities, but for the entire world. And so what the authorities are trying to do now is grapple with, how do I get information that I need to understand what's actually happening, which can be very hard when things are happening on the blockchain, and how do I get access to know when transactions occur? And so that's sort of the backdrop for why I think historically these structures have been set up in the way they have. But as Jack said, given the clarity or more clarity around these types of things going forward in the US, why companies may consider operating in the US and not trying to create something to fit into these random different types of scenarios. So maybe just kind of a normal life cycle of a typical TGE where a Cayman Foundation is used. There'll be an idea, a white paper, a protocol that's developed in the US that's sort of brought up, nurtured, and really kind of come to a point where it makes sense to move to mainnet, to put these out to market. And at that time, the founders need to make a decision. And if decentralization is a key component is going to be to tell the market that, hey, we're going this route, we're decentralizing, is I need to divest myself of control over the protocol, the assets. And commonly what happens is a Cayman Foundation is set up, and there's a few specific reasons for that. One is that foundations don't have to have directors or shareholders or shareholder equivalents. And so there's no real ultimate beneficial owner that is going to be benefiting from any accrued value in the foundation. And a lot of times that is reinforced within the foundation articles and the memorandums of association, et cetera, by providing that, you know, on liquidation, all of the assets will be given to charity, that nobody has the rights to distributions or things of that nature. From a US tax standpoint, that's also very important because if you are an investor or a shareholder in a foreign entity, the earnings of that foreign entity are subject to the US tax rules. And so when setting up the foundation, a key thing to think about and consider is looking at those indicia of shareholder or shareholder type equivalent rights, as well as looking at whether the US DevCo has effective control over the foundation. And so that's where you would need to look at things like, you know, the makeup of the board. Commonly, independent directors are used. But sometimes it's hard. You've grown this idea, you need to give it away, and you want to put some training wheels on it for a little while. And so a lot of times companies will implement sort of temporary safeguards to allow for that to happen. And you can do that as long as you're mindful about it in the right way through things like creating supervisors or protectors or things like that. So it's always a bit different based on what a company wants to do, how comfortable they are giving up control over the protocol and the underlying IP that are going to facilitate the token environment. But it's just a very important step in the process to have that disaffiliation. The second thing that companies need to consider is go-forward operations, sort of what does that look like? A lot of times, or most times, DevCo will really enter into a service agreement with the foundation, and it will continue to develop the IP, and it will continue to help grow the ecosystem, and often drive into different business models that are benefiting from the token issuance and the token environment, but not necessarily be involved in maintenance of the tokens or getting into the details of the transfers, holding custody over the assets, things like that. And so watching that and continuing to make sure that those individuals at DevCo or others in the United States aren't effectively viewed as agents of foundation, because that's where the US tax authorities come in and say, hey, you're operating here, foundation in the US, please report, please pay tax. There's lots of withholding requirements and documentation requirements. So I guess the key takeaway is that there's uncertainty from a tax standpoint, but there's a lot that you can do if you're looking at it at the startup from a legal perspective and from a rights perspective to help facilitate strong arguments that this structure should be respected and minimize tax risk.
And while we've seen a lot of regulatory updates from the SEC, there really hasn't been anything out of the IRS on the tax side, right? And some of the rules that we're dealing with for companies, let's say it's a US lab entity and they want to launch in the US, some of the rules that we're dealing with are decades old, right? They don't factor in tokens or blockchain or digital assets, how any of it works. And so there are issues on the US side right now that prohibit companies, again, it's doable, but there's some challenges, there's some roadblocks, right? Specifically when you're giving value to people in the form of an airdrop, there's usually no KYC, right? And so you can't withhold like you usually would. So there's what's called a backup withholding element that causes some challenges in doing that. So hopefully by end of the year, I know there are some lawmakers right now, along with the Clarity Act and the Market Infrastructure Act, that they're trying to pass by year end, where they're looking to fix this and perhaps making airdrops exempt. And if that happens, we'll probably see a lot more of the U.S. headquartered companies start to move away from that structure and launch in the U.S., but it's going to be interesting times. Mitzi, what about from the regulatory and legal standpoint?
Yeah, so just to back up, like the reason sort of all of this has happened in terms of non-U.S. Token issuances is because of the SEC, right? Because they were taking a position that all of these things that were happening, if you created the token, issued the token, distributed the token, you were the token issuer. And the last SEC, and really the SEC before that, viewed these as unregistered offerings of securities. There's a test called the Howey test. There's another one for debt securities called Reeves that sort of goes through what are the elements. And so they took the position that, look, all you're doing is selling securities, and because the value goes up, because you can trade these things. And so this sort of jurisdictional play was created, or sort of practitioners in the space created these structures to really decrease the, let's call it securities law touch points. So why was decentralization, which really just means like you don't have control, why was that so important? Because if you look at securities laws, there's all sorts of tests, right, that talk about who is in control and who's really, for example, influencing the price of a stock. So if you are a company that is, quote, influencing the price of a token, there's an element of control. And so as we know, if you look at sort of, prices of Bitcoin, for example, which people, there's an argument as to who controls that if you're really like a miner, but putting aside that, it goes with like the markets, right? Like no one's, really controlling it. So all of these structures just from like the last decade have really been created because of securities law concerns. So now we have the new SEC, we have a new administration. The regulatory enforcement risk, I think, has gone down a lot. You may have heard the term, the SEC's regulation by enforcement, in which they were sort of just coming after companies for doing what they thought were illegal securities offerings. So that risk has really gone down, and the tone has gone down. There's a much more friendly tone at the SEC, which frankly, when I first started in this practice, 10 years ago, they were actually very friendly and they were very interested in wanting to come, companies to come in and talk to them about their projects. And then when we did that, when lawyers did that with their clients, they got immediately served, right, with the subpoena. And you're like, well, that's not supposed to happen. So there was risk adjustments, but we just saw there were 3 no action letters, I think, in the last, sort of, let me say, let's say 4 or 5 years about tokens that basically, when you looked at it, you were like, well, duh, like that's obviously not a securities offering, right? If I'm going to give you airline points, that's not a securities offering. But very recently, in the last, I think it was 2 weeks, there was a new SEC no action letter that was about distribution of tokens to users. Through one example that the issuer, which was a Cayman Foundation, I believe, had sort of set out all the facts, and the SEC said, we don't believe that that is a securities offering. And it was specifically on that sort of distribution of users in a thriving ecosystem where no one controls that. It's really, this token has a use, there's a reason why people are using it in commerce. Now, it did not talk about the initial sale to, investors, for example, which was done pursuant to securities laws. So there is this sort of, we're in a weird time right now where we don't have actual legislation. We have SEC guidance, which they will always say you can't rely on, right? But people obviously do because it's out there. You have stablecoin legislation that was passed called the Genius Act, but that also says we actually need people to give us more structure and rules. So none of those rules are actually in place, and it takes, I think it's like 180 days after those final rules are published before before it's actually effective. There have been no final rules. So it is a very interesting sort of place that we are in right now, but I do think that the US, especially with this tone of regulatory agencies, is going to be the digital asset leader of the world. But it's going to take a little bit of time. So when all of this legislation happens, which hopefully will be by the end of the year, although they've already sort of pushed it out because it was supposed to happen at the end of September, I think we're going to see a huge change. So it's really exciting because it's been, a really, really long time coming. But at the end of the day, what I would say is what my clients sort of think about now, it's not necessarily the regulatory risk. You still obviously can't make fraudulent statements and things like that we always talk about. But the real issue is tax. And so, everything that sort of we've talked about in terms of nobody wants to get taxed. And so that is different, right? The IRS does have more stringent rules, some guidance, but it all comes back to tax.
And while IRS lost their 3 key digital asset people in the last few months, there is still legislation that's trying to be, along with the Clarity Act, right, that is going to help fix some of this. Again, the details matter, right? Some of the draft legislation in there includes exempting airdrops from taxation at the time of receipt, right? So that's taxable when sold. In addition to that, they have staking and mining, right? There's been some legislation in the past that also defer the taxation event not to the time you mine it, but to the time you sell the token, going back to some of the, the Jarrett court case that we saw a year or 2 ago. So, they're trying to catch up. I think, Senator Lummis, obviously being one of the leaders for the space, I think they've done a good job of taking feedback from the overall industry, right? Like even when you're seeing a lot of loans, right? You're seeing a lot of infrastructure set up for being able to borrow digital assets. Well, there's safe harbors for securities when you do that in some capacity where it's not a taxable event, right? For other types of property, Section 1058 rules, they don't apply to crypto, right? So that's also one of the things that they're trying to do, in addition to shutting the allowance for the wash sale rule for crypto as well. So there's going to be probably something hopefully happening by end of the year, as Mitzi said. So I think that'll really help with adoption. So we got 5 minutes left. Well, let's talk about some of the trends, right? For me personally, I think kind of piggybacking off of what Pat was saying earlier, outside of this conference, no one's talking about the convergence of AI and blockchain. I think it's going to probably be a bigger deal. I think in addition to everything that was mentioned earlier, I would say, what does AI do? AI runs models based off of data. Like any other model, bad data equals inaccurate results you cannot rely on. That's a big question. People who use AI, they're like, wow, this is really impressive. Is it right? And enter blockchain, enter immutable ledger, enter source of truth, right? And I think they need that in order to provide more accuracy into the models, which will also increase reliance, right? I mean, the example I like to give here is healthcare records. You could use blockchain to securely store them and know, like, okay, this these tests are for this individual, and you could use AI to analyze the data and come up with diagnostics, right? I think we're starting to see some of that, and I think we'll see a lot more of it. Obviously, the agentic payments, I think, are going to be huge, right? Google and Coinbase, they're collaborating on some of that. I mean, we're so early on the infrastructure for that. I think, as Pat mentioned, that's coming. I think we're leaving Web3. Web3 is behind us. I think we're entering Web4, the agentic web, right? Where it's read, write, own, and then use agents. And the other one, NFT use cases, Pat, I think it's going to be digital media authenticity, right? I think with AI, you're going to see a lot more fraud. I mean, I don't know, who's used Sora? Has anyone used Sora? It is insanely, it's just crazy. I don't know how to explain it. And so we're already starting to ask the questions of, is what I'm watching real or not, right? And so I think maybe every picture we take is going to be an NFT on a blockchain, and that's how we know whether it's real. Who knows? But I think there's companies trying to solve it, whether it's some sort of digital identity using blockchain or maybe NFTs. But Brandon, what trend are you thinking about for the next year?
Yeah, I think Pat brought this up earlier, but RWAs and the impact that will have just on the entire ecosystem of what it means to own an asset and have a digitalized version of that in terms of additional efficiency, cutting out more middlemen. It could have so many uses, even if you think about property and having to go down and get the title looked at and all of that stuff. If all of that's verifiable on the blockchain, that just cuts so much time and cost and complexity out of people's ability to trade in assets. So I think the challenge is probably going to be more of a public education of helping them draw the link between the digital and the real world asset, and how do we validate that. But I think that's going to be a huge driver of this over the next year.
How many people use a product on a blockchain in their everyday lives right now? 2 hands, maybe 3. How many people here have a California driver's license? Congratulations, you're on that list. The California driver's license, they use Tezos blockchain, and all that data, your DMV ID is on the blockchain. So it's already happening, but similar to the internet, it's happening behind the scenes. Mitzi, what about you? What trends are you thinking about?
Well, I think we're in the middle of a lot. Crypto M&A has been huge. As of, I think, 9/30, I think the statistic that I saw recently was there's been $9.8 billion of value in deals that have been announced, and there's obviously a lot of deals that have not been announced. There's a ton of stuff happening on digital asset treasuries and public companies and de-SPACs and reverse mergers, which have been really interesting, I think, and I think will actually change the scope of digital assets and supply when you have public companies voraciously buying whatever digital asset it is, and being more free to do things like staking, which a digital asset ETF right now is not able to do. So I think there's just a lot happening in this space, and it's a really exciting time. And it's really funny because we've had clients who used to whisper to us about digital assets when we first started this practice 10 years ago. All the big banks, all the big companies, and now they never wanted to talk about it. And obviously now it's a very different time where people are really thinking about the opportunities. And really a lot of strategic acquisitions in this space too, and people are looking at this and saying, instead of building it, I'm just gonna buy it. And they have excess cash because the capital markets, frankly, have been very slow, so there's not a lot of liquidity, and so they have just so much cash to use, and also potentially tokens as payment. So I think it's an exciting time.
Great, well, that's it for us. We appreciate everyone's joining in and listening.